I think this is a very important issue, and let me make it immediately clear that it should. There can be improvements, it does take too long, and I entirely agree that in order to bring forward needed developments like wind power, perhaps solar energy, I very much agree we need changes. But what I think is at stake in this white paper, which Parliament didn't talk about, and I want to say a word or two about, is I think the deregulation of the current planning system in order, it seems to me from a reading of it, to prioritise economic growth over environmental and social criteria. And I have to say I think this is a serious mistake, and I think the government ought to have a further look at some of these proposals. Now the justification is, as Parliament had said, that some planning decisions take too long. The one most normally quoted, of course, is Heathrow Terminal 5, which took 8 years, maybe 10 years, I don't know, but that's far too long, although one has to say that quite a significant bit of that is accounted for by the time the report spent on Minister's desk after it was submitted. But I agree that it shouldn't take excessively long. I agree that improvements could be made, but I think these particular proposals are motivated by additional and rather different criteria, which I disapprove of, and I would expect a Labour government to disapprove of. Now, there are three parts to this white paper. The first is that what is proposed in it is that there will be new national policy statements will be drawn up for an array of major developments, and it's pretty clear that these are nuclear power stations, nuclear waste facilities, coal-fired power stations, airport expansions, major road schemes, large waste incinerators, amongst others. The really key point about this is that these statements, and this is the crucial point, will predetermine issues of need, safety, and even location of some projects. And according to the white paper, and I quote the words, these statements will have more weight than any other statement of national, regional, or local policy, unquote. Second point, there is then to be appointed a new body, which is called Infrastructure Planning Commission, which will decide on major project proposals in accordance with the national policy statements. And it will then, this body, this commission, will then have the power to confer the obligations, indeed even to amend legislation in order to implement nationally significant infrastructure projects. And here again is the crucial point. The decisions of the Infrastructure Planning Commission will be final. The Minister will no longer be able to take any relevant decisions on this particular matter, and I don't have to tell you that that removes all direct democratic accountability. The third point is, which follows partly from the first two, is that the public will lose the right to be heard and to cross-examine witnesses in public inquiries. Instead, the Infrastructure Planning Commission will have the discretion as to whether individuals can give evidence, and if so, in what way. But no questions can be asked about whether the project or the infrastructure is needed, whether it is safe, and where it's going to be located. It would simply be a matter of how a development, which has already been decided on, is actually going to be implemented. So what will be the effects of this process? Well, again, I just want to make 2 or 3 points. First, obviously, public participation is going to be minimised. I'd be the first to recognise that sometimes it can be vexatious, it can be over-lengthy, and it can be unreasonable. But that is not an argument for almost totally suppressing it. Now, at the present moment, community involvement is statutorily safeguarded, both at the issues and options stage and at the preferred options stage. But these opportunities, which are actually in statute at the present time, are going to be legislatively swept away. And they will be replaced by a general duty on councils to consult but of course it is up to them as to exactly how they do it. There are no directions as to how that will be done. In other words, at present, there are statements of community involvement which have to be examined in accordance with required minimum standards, but that legislative safeguard is now to be removed. Secondly, in the case of major infrastructure projects, it is proposed that the community consultation, believe it or not, will be carried out by the developer, as though a development promoter is actually going to be the person who thoroughly or even seriously examines other alternative options. I really do think we should look at that again. Thirdly, and just, I could give many examples, but one which I think is particularly significant, the removal of the needs test will, for example, undoubtedly favour supermarket developers. We're talking about Tesco's, and so they need any encouragement, as do Walmart, Morrison's and the rest, in making it obviously much easier to get out-of-town supermarkets. And I think the planning white paper, if you read it, and I encourage you to do so, makes very clear what side it is on when it says it aims, and I quote, to promote competition and consumer choice and not unduly or disproportionately constrain the market, unquote. I think that makes it clear. So my last point is, why do these proposals need to be changed and how should we do it? Well, first of all, the government says it is necessary, and Pandit actually hinted at this, by saying it's necessary to make it easier to get major infrastructure projects through in order to tackle climate change. Well, I think exactly the opposite is true, because it is precisely these large infrastructure projects which actually create most of the greenhouse gas emissions and which also create the pollution. Because it is the particularly coal-fired power stations, to some extent rather less, gas-fired power stations which do produce most of the fossil fuel pollution, and also, of course, nuclear power stations and large incinerators with nuclear waste, which actually produces a lot of the long-term pollution. The real way, and I'm very glad that Pandit actually emphasised this, the real way to tackle climate change is, in my view, of course, to move much faster than we are at the present moment towards decentralised energy systems, which are low carbon or no carbon. Don't forget, this country has a lower proportion of its electricity generation from renewables than any other country in Europe. It's about 4%. The average in the rest of Europe is 15 to 25%. In Scandinavia, it's 30 to 40%. That's where we ought to be concentrating, whilst at the same time phasing out fossil fuels. And the other problem, of course, rising greenhouse gases from car and air travel, that's another matter. Secondly, removing the public right to be heard, and I say the public right to be heard on such major matters affecting their lives is clearly wrong, because it's anti-democratic, but also because it removes the right, the pressure on the developer to consult in order to gain public consent. And I think that's very important. Okay, if you're going to have one of these big projects, it should be by consent. At the very minimum, the public should have the right to be heard when far-reaching policy is drawn up in the national policy statements and when decisions are made on the ground. And I am going to wind up. There will be, just let me wind up by saying this, there will be no trust, in my view, in a process if people's involvement is at the discretion of unelected, unaccountable bodies like the Infrastructure Policy Commission. I think this is yet another example, sadly, where the government has done a deal with the big vested interests, the big industries which are responsible, of course, for these infrastructure developments, which gives priority to corporate power over public interest. So finally, yes, I'm all in favour of more efficient and quicker public inquiries, but they have got to inspire public confidence, and I'm afraid these proposals don't.